There's a version of your life you haven't lived yet. And the distance between where you are right now and that version has almost nothing to do with effort, discipline, or strategy. It has to do with something you can't see, something operating underneath every decision you make, every relationship you choose, every pattern you repeat, something so close to you that it's become invisible. Like a lens you've been looking through your entire life without realizing you're wearing it. Carl Jung spent his career studying that lens. He mapped it. He named its parts. He showed his patients how to take it off, even for a moment, and most of them broke down when they saw what had actually been in front of them the whole time. What Jung uncovered about the human psyche remains, to this day, the most practically useful framework for understanding why you do what you do, why you suffer the way you suffer, and why the same problems keep finding you no matter how many times you think you've solved them. Today, I'm going to walk you through the lessons Jung spent a lifetime discovering, the ones that, once you understand them, rearrange how you see yourself, your relationships, and the life you've been building without fully realizing what you were building or why. These aren't abstract theories, they're mirrors, and some of what you see in them will be uncomfortable, but that discomfort is the point. It's the only door that leads anywhere real. Let's start with the lesson Jung considered the most important, and the one almost everyone resists the hardest. Everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself doesn't disappear, it goes underground. It operates from the basement of your psyche, influencing your choices, your reactions, your attractions, your repulsions, all without your awareness. Jung called this the shadow, and he believed it was the single most important concept in all of psychology, because until you face your shadow, you are being lived by forces you can't see and don't understand. Your shadow contains everything you've decided is unacceptable about yourself, the anger you were told was wrong, the selfishness you were shamed for, the sexuality, the ambition, the darkness, the pettiness. Anything that your family, your culture, your religion, or your early experiences taught you had to be hidden. You didn't destroy these parts, you buried them. And buried things don't stay still, they grow roots. Jung watched this play out in patient after patient. A woman who prided herself on being endlessly generous would attract takers and users into her life, over and over again, despite swearing she'd learned her lesson. A man who identified as rational and controlled would erupt in disproportionate rage at small provocations. A spiritual seeker who preached love and compassion would quietly sabotage anyone who threatened their status in their community. In every case, the shadow was running the show. The generous woman couldn't acknowledge her own selfishness, so she attracted people who expressed it for her. The controlled man had disowned his rage, so it leaked out sideways in moments he couldn't predict. The spiritual seeker had buried their competitiveness under layers of enlightened language, so it came out as passive aggression and subtle cruelty disguised as guidance. Here's what made Jung's framework so devastating and so useful. He didn't say the shadow was your enemy. He said the shadow was you, the real you, the parts of you that have as much right to exist as the parts you've decided to show the world. And the project of becoming a whole human being required bringing those parts back into the light, acknowledging them, integrating them, letting them have a seat at the table instead of forcing them to operate from the dark where they cause the most damage. This is where most people get stuck, because facing your shadow means admitting things you'd rather not admit. It means saying, out loud, or at least to yourself, I am capable of cruelty. I am sometimes selfish. I have jealousy in me. I have rage. I have desires that don't match the image I project. And that admission feels like it will destroy you, because you've spent your entire life constructing an identity based on being the opposite of those things. But Jung found the opposite was true. People who integrated their shadow didn't become worse. They became more honest, more grounded, more real. They stopped leaking their darkness in unconscious ways and started channeling it with awareness. The woman who acknowledged her selfishness stopped attracting takers because she could meet her own needs directly. The man who accepted his rage found it transformed into appropriate assertiveness. The spiritual seeker who owned their competitiveness became genuinely helpful because they were no longer secretly competing while pretending to serve. The The shadow integrated becomes power. The shadow denied becomes fate. And most people are living inside their fate right now, watching the same patterns repeat, wondering why they can't break free, while the answer sits in the one place they refuse to look. Now, if the shadow is what you've rejected about yourself, the persona is what you've constructed in its place. And this is the second lesson Jung would insist you understand, because the persona is so familiar to you that you've probably mistaken it for who you actually are. Jung used the word persona deliberately. It comes from the Latin word for mask. The persona is the version of yourself you present to the world, the agreeable one, the competent one, the funny one, the strong one. Whatever role you learned would keep you safe and earn you belonging, that's your persona. And there's nothing inherently wrong with having one. We all need social masks to navigate the world. The problem starts when you forget it's a mask. Jung saw this happen constantly. Someone would build a persona so convincing, wear it for so many years, that they genuinely lost track of who existed underneath it. They'd become the successful executive, the nurturing mother, the spiritual teacher, the loyal friend, and the identity would feel so real, so solid, that any threat to it triggered panic. Because somewhere deep down, they sensed that if the mask came off, there might be nothing behind it. Or worse, there might be something behind it they couldn't face. This is why midlife crises happen. This is why people who've done everything right suddenly feel hollow at 45. This is why achievements that should feel satisfying feel empty. The persona got exactly what the persona wanted: the career, the relationship, the status, the approval. But the person underneath the persona was never consulted. Their actual desires, their real values, their genuine needs were ignored for decades while the mask collected its rewards. Jung would have called the process of removing the persona one of the most terrifying and necessary acts a human can undertake. Because you built that mask for survival. You built it when you were young and figured out what was rewarded and what was punished. You built it to belong. And letting it go feels like letting go of belonging itself. But here's what Jung observed in patients who did the work. On the other side of the persona, there's a self you've never fully met, someone with preferences you've been overriding, boundaries you've been ignoring, desires you've been suppressing, someone who might want a completely different life than the one you've been performing. And meeting that person is simultaneously the most disorienting and the most liberating experience a human being can have. This connects directly to the third lesson, and it's the one Jung called the central task of human life: individuation, becoming who you actually are. Individuation sounds simple until you try to do it. It means peeling off the persona, integrating the shadow, confronting every pattern you inherited from your family, your culture, your collective history, and choosing, consciously, who you want to be rather than remaining who you were shaped to be. It means becoming an individual in the truest sense, someone whose life reflects their actual nature rather than the expectations they absorbed. Jung didn't frame individuation as a self-improvement project. He framed it as a calling, something that pulls at you whether you respond to it or not. That restless feeling you can't explain, the sense that something is missing even when your life looks fine on paper, the vague but persistent feeling that you're performing a role in someone else's story rather than living your own. That's individuation knocking. That's the self underneath the mask trying to get your attention. And most people spend their lives ignoring that knock, because answering it means change, real change, the kind that might cost you relationships that depend on you staying the same, the kind that might require you to leave a career you've invested decades in, the kind that will definitely require you to disappoint people who need you to keep wearing the mask. Jung was honest about the price. Individuation is lonely. When you start becoming who you actually are, the people who loved the mask don't always recognize you, or want to. Friends fall away, family dynamics shift. The social circles that embrace the persona feel suffocating to the authentic self. And there's a period, sometimes a long one, where you've outgrown the old life but haven't yet built the new one. You're standing in open space with nothing familiar to hold on to. This is where most people turn back. They feel the loneliness, the disorientation, the loss, and they put the mask back on. They return to the familiar role. They tell themselves it wasn't that bad. They convince themselves that comfort is the same thing as rightness. But Jung saw what happened to people who turned back. The knock gets louder. The restlessness grows. The body starts speaking what the conscious mind refuses to say. In anxiety, depression, chronic illness, addiction. The self you're refusing to become doesn't stop trying to emerge. It just finds increasingly painful ways to get your attention. And Jung saw what happened to people who kept going. Through the loneliness, through the disorientation, through the grief of shedding an identity they'd worn for decades, something began to form in the empty space. Something solid, something real. A life that actually fit them rather than one they had to contort themselves to occupy. Relationships built on authenticity rather than mutual performance. A sense of purpose that came from within rather than from external validation. That's individuation. And it's the hardest, most worthwhile thing a human being can do. Now, there's a mechanism that keeps individuation from happening, and Jung considered it one of the most important psychological discoveries of his career. Projection. And understanding projection will change how you see every conflict, every attraction, and every strong reaction you've ever had to another person. Projection works like this. Whatever you can't face in yourself, you see in other people. The qualities you've buried in your shadow get projected outward onto the world, and you experience them as if they belong entirely to someone else. This happens automatically, unconsciously, and with absolute conviction that what you're seeing is objective reality. Jung found that projection operates in both directions, toward what you despise and toward what you worship. When you have an intense, disproportionate reaction to someone's behavior, when something about them infuriates you beyond what the situation warrants, Jung would tell you to look in the mirror. That intensity is a signal. What you're reacting to so strongly in them is often something you carry in yourself but refuse to acknowledge. The person who's enraged by arrogance in others often carries unacknowledged arrogance. The person who can't tolerate weakness in others has often buried their own vulnerability so deep they've forgotten it exists. The person disgusted by selfishness in others is frequently someone who was shamed out of having needs. This doesn't mean the other person isn't actually behaving badly. They might be. But the disproportionate intensity of your reaction, the way it hooks you, consumes you, keeps you up at night, that part belongs to you. That's your shadow waving at you through someone else's face. The same mechanism works with admiration. When you put someone on a pedestal, when you idealize them, when you're convinced they possess qualities you could never have, that's projection too. You're seeing your own unlived potential and attributing it to someone else because you can't yet claim it as yours. The mentor you worship often embodies qualities you haven't given yourself permission to develop. The partner you idealize often carries the parts of yourself you've abandoned. Jung saw projection as both a trap and a gift. The trap is obvious. You spend your life fighting with mirrors, falling in love with mirrors, never seeing clearly because everything is filtered through your own unprocessed material. But the gift is that projection creates a map. Every strong reaction you have to another person is showing you exactly what you need to integrate. Your enemies point toward your shadow. Your heroes point toward your unlived life. Both are invitations to become more whole. Once you start seeing projection at work, you can't unsee it. Every argument with your partner starts looking different. Every person who irritates you at work becomes interesting instead of infuriating. Every person you admire becomes a clue rather than a deity. And the whole landscape of your relationships transforms from a battlefield into a mirror, one that shows you, with ruthless accuracy, what still needs to be faced. If you've been feeling the weight of these patterns in your own life, if something here is landing in a way that feels both uncomfortable and true, there's a resource that might help you sit with what's coming up. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you look at exactly the kind of material we're talking about here. Not theory, practice. the actual work of turning toward what you've been avoiding. You'll find the link below. Let's keep going, because the next lesson connects everything we've discussed so far and reveals something most people will never understand about their own suffering. Jung believed that suffering was meaningful, and before you dismiss that as spiritual bypassing, understand what he actually meant, because it's the opposite of everything happens for a reason or pain is a gift. Jung was a psychiatrist. He sat with people in agony. He didn't minimize their pain or rush them towards silver linings. What he observed was that suffering, when met consciously, produced transformation that nothing else could. And suffering that was avoided, numbed, or bypassed produced repetition. The same pain, recycled, showing up in different costumes but wearing the same face underneath. The difference was consciousness. Conscious suffering, the kind where you face what hurts, sit with why it hurts, trace it back to its origin, that kind of suffering burns something away. It burns away illusion. It burns away the persona's false promises. It burns away the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself about your relationships, your choices, your motivations. And what's left after that burning is something clean, something true, something you can actually build on. Unconscious suffering is what most people do. They feel the pain and immediately try to escape it. Through distraction, through substances, through keeping busy, through finding someone to blame, through spiritual practices that promise transcendence without transformation. And because they never face the pain directly, it stays active, it circulates, it finds new situations to express itself through. The same wound, playing out through different people and different scenarios over and over for a lifetime. Jung saw this loop in his practice so frequently that he developed a principle around it. What you don't make conscious comes to you as fate. Read that again. What you refuse to look at doesn't go away. It shows up in your life as events that seem to happen to you. The same type of partner, the same kind of betrayal, the same pattern of collapse. You experience these as bad luck or external circumstance. Jung saw them as the unconscious creating the exact situations needed to force you to face what you're avoiding. This changes everything about how you interpret difficulty. That relationship that keeps falling apart in the same way, there's a pattern underneath it that's yours, waiting to be seen. That recurring problem at work, something in your shadow is engineering it. That feeling of being stuck despite trying everything, the thing you haven't tried is looking at yourself honestly. Jung didn't say this to blame people for their suffering. He said it to empower them. Because if your unconscious patterns are creating your circumstances, then becoming conscious of those patterns gives you actual power to change your circumstances. You stop being a victim of fate and start becoming a participant in your own life. The loop breaks when you finally look at what it's been trying to show you. This leads to something Jung understood about relationships that most psychology still hasn't fully absorbed. Your relationships are mirrors of your internal state, every single one. And the patterns in your relationships will keep repeating until you change what's inside, because the outside is always reflecting the inside. Jung observed that people select partners, friends, and even enemies based on unconscious needs. You're drawn to people who match your wounds. The woman with abandonment trauma finds the man who's emotionally unavailable, every time, with uncanny precision. The man who grew up feeling unseen chooses the partner who can't or won't see him. The person who was controlled in childhood builds relationships where they're either controlling or being controlled. These aren't coincidences. These are the unconscious, playing matchmaker with your shadow. And here's the part that stings. You're not just the victim in these dynamics. You're a co-creator. Your wounds don't just attract certain people. They make you available to certain people. They make you tolerant of behavior you shouldn't tolerate. They make you blind to red flags that anyone without your specific wound would see immediately. They make you stay long past the point where a healthy person would leave because the dysfunction feels familiar, and familiar feels like home, even when home was a war zone. Jung would push his patients to stop asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and start asking, "What in me keeps choosing this?" That shift, from victim to participant, is where everything changes. Because once you see your own role in the pattern, you have leverage. You can change yourself in ways you can never change another person. And when you change, the pattern has to change too, because you're no longer the same piece in the same puzzle. This doesn't mean you caused someone's cruelty toward you. It means you can understand why you were available for it, why you stayed, why you'll stay again if you don't address the root. And addressing the root is the only intervention that actually works long-term. Everything else is rearranging furniture in a house with a cracked foundation. Jung talked about something bigger than individual psychology, and this is where his work takes on a dimension that feels almost uncanny, the collective unconscious. And understanding it helps you make sense of patterns that seem to have no personal origin, things you carry that you didn't consciously learn, reactions you have that don't connect to anything in your own history, fears and drives and pulls that feel ancient. Jung proposed that beneath your personal unconscious, the shadow, the repressed material, the forgotten experiences, there's a deeper layer that belongs to everyone. Patterns of experience so old and so universal that they're woven into the structure of human consciousness itself. He called these patterns archetypes, and he saw them operating everywhere, in myths, in dreams, in the choices people make when they think they're being completely original. The mother, the father, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the shadow, the self. These aren't just characters in stories, they're psychological forces that shape how you experience reality. When you fall in love, you're not just responding to the person in front of you, you're responding to an archetypal pattern that's been playing out in human consciousness for thousands of years. When you feel called to a purpose, that pull has roots deeper than your personal history. When you encounter a situation and feel you've been here before, not literally, but structurally, in the bones of the experience, that's the collective unconscious recognizing a pattern it knows intimately. Jung didn't present this as mysticism. He presented it as observable psychology. He found the same symbols appearing in the dreams of people who had no cultural connection to those symbols. He found the same story structures playing out in the lives of people from completely different backgrounds. He found that certain psychological crises followed archetypal patterns so precisely that he could almost predict the stages someone would move through based on which archetype had been activated. What this means practically is that some of what you're carrying isn't yours alone. Some of the weight comes from patterns that run in your family line, your cultural history, your entire species. And this can be both terrifying and relieving. Terrifying because it means the forces operating on you are bigger than you imagined. Relieving because it means some of the confusion you feel makes perfect sense. You're not just navigating your own psyche, you're navigating ancestral currents that have been flowing long before you were born. Jung's response to this wasn't helplessness, it was consciousness. You can't stop archetypes from operating, but you can become aware of them. You can recognize when an archetypal pattern has been activated in your life and respond with wisdom rather than being swept away by forces you can't see. The person who recognizes they're in a hero's journey can navigate it differently than someone who's just confused about why everything in their life is falling apart. The person who sees the shadow archetype at work in their relationships can stop blaming their partners and start doing internal work. Awareness of the pattern gives you choice within it. There's another lesson from Jung that connects all of this, and it might be the most counterintuitive thing he ever taught. You cannot heal by moving away from your darkness. You can only heal by moving through it. The entire modern wellness industry is built on the opposite assumption. Raise your vibration, think positive, focus on the light, cut out negativity, surround yourself with good energy. And all of this sounds reasonable until you realize what it's actually asking you to do. Abandon the parts of yourself that need attention the most. Jung watched people try this approach for decades, and he documented what happened. They'd meditate, journal, affirm, practice gratitude, attend retreats. They'd build increasingly elaborate spiritual lives, and underneath all of it, the shadow grew. The unaddressed wounds festered. The persona got more sophisticated. The gap between who they appeared to be and who they actually were widened until something cracked. a breakdown, a betrayal, a crisis that shattered the spiritual facade and exposed everything that had been ignored. This wasn't because spirituality is useless. It was because they were using spiritual practice as a way to avoid psychological honesty. They were rising above their humanity instead of moving through it. And Jung was clear that consciousness only deepens in one direction: down, into the shadow, into the wound, into the parts of yourself you'd rather transcend than face. The path through is harder than the path above. The path above lets you feel enlightened. The path through makes you feel broken before it makes you feel whole. The path above looks impressive to others. The path through often looks like a mess. Therapy that gets worse before it gets better. Relationships that end because you can't tolerate dysfunction anymore. Periods of isolation where you're confronting material you've spent your entire life avoiding. But the path through is the only one that actually leads somewhere. Jung observed this consistently. The patients who were willing to descend into their own darkness, who sat with the discomfort, who faced the parts of themselves they'd been running from, those patients transformed, genuinely. Their relationships changed because they changed. Their patterns broke because they addressed the roots. Their suffering became meaningful because it was metabolized into wisdom rather than recycled into repetition. The patients who kept trying to rise above it, who chased transcendence, who bypassed their pain with positive thinking, who built spiritual identities over unhealed wounds, those patients stayed stuck, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Looking evolved while remaining fundamentally unchanged. If there's one thing I want you to carry away from everything we've covered, one lens that changes how you see everything, it's this: your relationship with your own darkness determines the quality of your entire life. Your willingness to face what you've buried determines whether you keep repeating your patterns or finally break free. Your capacity to sit with discomfort, to look at the unflattering parts, to acknowledge the shadow without being destroyed by it. That's the variable. That's what separates the people who actually grow from the people who just collect the vocabulary of growth while nothing underneath shifts. Jung would tell you that the goal isn't to become someone without darkness. The goal is to become someone who knows their darkness so intimately that it can no longer operate unconsciously. Someone whose shadow has been brought into the light, where it still exists, still has energy, but is integrated rather than repressed. Where your anger becomes appropriate boundary setting, where your selfishness becomes healthy self-care, where your ambition becomes purposeful drive, where every quality you buried because it was deemed unacceptable finds its rightful place in a whole, honest life. This is what integration looks like. And it's the only real foundation for anything, for relationships, for purpose, for inner peace, for the kind of life that feels genuinely yours rather than performed. There's one more thing Jung understood that ties everything together, and I've saved it for last because it's the lesson that tends to rewrite people's understanding of their entire history once they grasp it. Your wounds are precise. They're not random. The specific ways you were hurt created specific patterns that are now generating specific results in your life. And those results will keep coming until you trace them back to their origin with enough honesty to see the full picture. The child who was shamed for having needs becomes the adult who can't ask for help. The child who was praised only for achievement becomes the adult who can't rest. The child whose emotions were treated as burdens becomes the adult who apologizes for having feelings. The child who watched their parents' mood dictate the household atmosphere becomes the adult who's hypervigilant about everyone's emotional state. These aren't personality traits, they're adaptations, survival strategies that made perfect sense when you were small and powerless and needed to navigate an environment you couldn't control. Your psyche built exactly what it needed to build to keep you safe, and it did its job. You survived. But you're still running those programs now in a life where they no longer serve you. The hypervigilance that kept you safe as a child now keeps you exhausted as an adult. The people-pleasing that earned you love from an unpredictable parent now keeps you trapped in relationships where your needs don't exist. The emotional suppression that kept the household stable now keeps you disconnected from your own inner life. Jung didn't view these patterns with judgment. He viewed them with profound respect, and then he insisted they needed to change. Respect the adaptation for what it accomplished. Honor the child who built it. And then, with the awareness you now have as an adult, begin the slow work of replacing survival strategies with actual living. This work is specific because the wounds are specific. Generic self-help doesn't touch it. Love yourself doesn't reach the child who learned love was conditional. Set boundaries doesn't help the person whose boundaries were violated so early they don't know what a boundary feels like from the inside. Be authentic is meaningless advice to someone who built a persona at age 6 and hasn't seen their real face since. What helps is precision. Understanding your exact wound, seeing how it created your exact pattern, tracing that pattern through your relationships, your career, your inner life, watching how it threads through everything with a consistency that would be impressive if it weren't so painful. And then, with that clarity, making different choices, small ones at first, saying no when the old pattern would have said yes, staying quiet when the old pattern would have rushed to fix, asking for something when the old pattern would have insisted you didn't need anything. Each different choice is a small rebellion against a pattern that's been running for decades, and each rebellion weakens the pattern's grip, slowly, imperfectly, with backsliding and frustration and moments where you fall right back into the old groove. But over time, the new choices accumulate, the pattern loosens, space opens up. And in that space, the person you might have been, the one who existed before the wound reshaped everything, starts to emerge. Jung called this the process of becoming yourself, and he considered it sacred work, the most important thing a human being could do with their time on Earth. Because when you become yourself, genuinely, fully, with your shadow integrated and your persona set aside, and your wounds understood and your patterns faced, you bring something into the world that didn't exist before, something that only you can bring, something the world needs, whether it knows it or not. That's the promise of this work, and the price is everything you thought you were. If you've made it this far and something in you is responding to all of this, if these patterns feel less like theory and more like someone describing the architecture of your actual life, there's something that might help you take the next step. We created a guide called True Self-Discovery, built around 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings. It's designed to help you begin the work we've been talking about here, facing the shadow, examining the persona, tracing your wounds with precision, moving from understanding to practice. The link's below whenever you're ready.